Hello, welcome to the Florida Daily Show. My name's Ron Davis. I'm filling in for Ed Dean. You can find more information about me at attorneyrondavis.com. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about birthright. We heard last week some arguments before the Supreme Court. First, Donald Trump showed up. I don't think there's ever been a sitting president. I did learn, and you all might be interested to learn this, that there's always been a seat available for the president at the oral arguments. I never knew that, but it's always been there and it's always been empty, but it's always been a reserved seat, kind of like what you might see at the State of the Union addresses where the Supreme Court justices always have their reserved seats there. Not all of them show up, as we saw this last one. But anyway, I thought that was a little bit of trivia I was never aware of. So a lot of people, and I have a different take. I have a much different take on what we heard in the Supreme Court than what I'm getting from a lot of other commentators. And as I guess those of you who listen to the Ed Dean show and have heard me speak on this, I'm not a home team player. I mean, if Trump does something that I don't like, I am not a Trumper all the way. He can do no wrong. I'm critical. Okay, I'm critical. I mean, I've said it. If I love his policies, I just kind of wish we didn't have his commentary, and that's the reality. But I got a different take, and again, it's not because I'm a homer. It's so much of the argument about the birthright citizenship it centers on the word jurisdiction, okay, within the jurisdiction, and whether or not they rightfully are there, and then I guess there's some discussion in terms of birthright. And birthright is whether or not somebody who was born on United States soil, just by virtue of being born on United States soil, becomes a U.S. citizen. And there's always been nuances. There's been exceptions. Like if you're a foreign diplomat, and it came down to questions of, did you intend to remain here? Were you flying over and you had emergency and you land and the child was pregnant? Does the child automatically become a United States citizen? But a lot of people and a lot of commentators who listen to this seem to really think that it was tilted in favor of or tilted against the Trump position. I disagree. I do think it's close. Don't get me wrong. I think it's going to be a 5-4 decision, but I think it's going to be a 5-4 decision. But I think a lot of the questions, and I think it's going to be a 5-4 decision saying that if you're here illegally, if you came here illegally, your parents, in other words, came illegally and you were born, that you're not going to have citizenship. And I think a lot of the critical questions that they were doing is because people are confusing this whole issue of jurisdiction. They're confusing the issue of and the media's done a great job of this, right? Because they never mention immigration. It's illegal immigration. We Republicans are not opposed to immigration. Love immigration. It's what made this country, great. And immigration was never easy. Everybody acts like people just came over. They don't understand how hard it was to get through Ellis Island, right? Coming through New York or down in Corpus Christi through the other point. You had to pass an IQ test. You had to pass a physical. Guess what? Families were constantly separated. Families were sent back while other parts of the family were allowed to stay. If you couldn't pass a physical standpoint, you had to be physically able to work, and you had to have the willingness to work, and you had to be smart enough to work. Those are the people that got accepted. If you were sick, you had diseases, mentally deficient, couldn't pass a basic IQ test, they didn't let you in. And it was brutal sometimes. People don't talk about that. They just act like you jumped on a boat and you came over and you got to stay. No, it wasn't like that. Sometimes they'd be quarantined for months and still get sent back overseas. If you weren't a certain height, you weren't a certain weight, it was brutal. So it was never easy to get in here. You just had you had to be very willing and able and fight to get in. All right. So that's completely different. But what liberals want to make you think is that's what immigration is that they're talking. No, they're not. They're not talking about that immigration. We're not talking about that immigration. Illegal, you cross the border illegally without any reason, without any permission. Those are the individuals that we're talking about. The 10, the 20, the 30 million, however many it may be that crossed over the Biden administration, that were here, that came in, never checked in. We're not talking about the people that came in, applied for asylum, were granted temporary asylum, or granted some sort of conditional, and were released into the country. We may not like it, may not agree with the policy, but they're here legally. And I think when you listen and you go back and you listen to the questioning, the justices were very good at breaking down all the different scenarios and beating up the attorney general on those issues. And it sounded like they were beating him up, but in my view, what was really happening is they were really separating the issues and the points. And it sounded critical because it's a critical point and a critical issue. And I think the way this falls at the end of the day is it's going to say, if you get to the border, you're picked up, and then you're released into the United States with a hearing date or something like that, you're not necessarily here at that point illegally or uninvited. You've at least come in and expressed an intention to stay. But if you don't get picked up and you don't check in and you don't do anything, in other words, you're purely legal, I think that class, I think when the Supreme Court enters its decision, it's going to let a whole swath of people in. They're going to make the Republicans uncomfortable. But I think it's going to exclude those that are completely here legally. Now, let's just say that you are a student on a student visa and you overstay the visa and you kind of disappear. Well, technically, you were allowed in the country. You followed a procedure to be here. Now, you overstayed that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that from a criminal standpoint that you're illegal at that point. That's a civil issue. And I think those would. So I'm kind of giving you some examples. And this is just based on my reading of the Supreme Court. Have I been wrong before? Of course. Anybody that ever comes in and tells you that they're 100% accurate on what the Supreme Court's going to do on every issue is full of you-know-what. I'm just looking at the questioning. I'm looking at who's the question, and I'm looking at what I think is the intent behind the question, and I'm looking at the issues. Remember, the liberal media and too many of the Republicans are just taking this hard line, everything's illegal. And there's not. There's nuances. And anybody that's practicing immigration law, and I don't, but I've had a little bit of experience in where it crosses over into criminal law and where it crosses over into family law, that I've got enough experience to kind of get a sense for what people are doing. There are ways that you can be here illegally, technically, but still have followed a process which allows you to be on the soil. And if then they get pregnant, that's different. And I think that's where the Supreme Court's going to come out. I hope that helps clear up some of this. I could be wrong. The Supreme Court could come back in and say, nope, birthright, if you were born here, no matter how you got here, you're a citizen. They could do that. They could do that. I mean, I can clearly see how people listening to that could take that from what I heard. I heard it different. And I put different meaning on the questions. And I do think they're going to carve out exceptions. But I think the general overriding view at the end of the day, or their ruling, is going to be, if you came across without any involvement with the government and are truly here illegally, smuggling in or whatnot, your birthright's not going to apply to you. And that's going to create some heartbreaking issues, which, of course, Democrats love. Boy, they love when they can beat up Republicans on broken households, right? Doesn't mean anything to them. They don't really care, but it's great politics for them. So that's my analysis. We'll find out if I'm right or wrong, probably 4 to 6 months from now. But it's going to be interesting to see. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you continue to tune in. Really appreciate you all listening and tuning in to Florida Daily Show. Thank you very much.